Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Neil Howard, here on Health Professional Radio. Thank you for joining us once again. Our guest on the show today is Mr. David Arthur. He's CEO of Salarius Pharmaceuticals, and he's joining us here on the program to talk about the enrollment in a phase 1 trial for their lead program, which is for the treatment of Ewing Sarcoma. Ewing Sarcoma is a devastating pediatric illness whose current treatment is chemotherapy, radiation, and or tumor resection. Welcome to the program, David Arthur. Thanks for taking the time this morning.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Neil.
Well, give us a bit about yourself. You're CEO of Salarius Pharmaceuticals. Are you a medical professional who's gone into pharmaceuticals? What's your background briefly?
Well, Neil, I'm a career pharmaceutical executive. I'm an engineer by training with an MBA, and after graduating business school, went to work for Eli Lilly. And then after that, spent a few years with Boehringer Ingelheim. And during that career, had a number of fantastic roles with both companies, but settled into an area that people refer to as product development and product launch. And really found that to be an exciting area because it gives you the opportunity to develop and introduce new medicines to help people.
Is this the first pharmaceutical company that you've been the head of?
Well, it's the first biotech I've worked with, and it is the first. It is my first CEO assignment. It has been just an amazing adventure, a great journey, and there's more to come.
Now, Solarius is, as I said, is a pharmaceutical company. Your company is enrolled in a phase 1 trial for the treatment of Ewing Sarcoma. What is Ewing Sarcoma?
Well, Neil, I'm glad you asked. And you touched on this in your introduction. Ewing sarcoma is a devastating pediatric and young adult bone cancer. And as you mentioned, there are currently very limited treatments. And in fact, there are no approved targeted treatments for Ewing sarcoma. So these children and young adults are initially treated with adult chemotherapy medicines. Sometimes, and actually most of the time, radiation, and unfortunately, in many cases, surgical resection of both the tumor and oftentimes the bone. So you can imagine the standard of care that is available to these folks is just devastating all on its own. Now, the even more difficult part of the disease is even when this initial therapy works, you can imagine the long-term physical and mental and emotional consequences developmentally for these kids. So we are partnering with the National Pediatric Cancer Foundation, whose mission is to develop less toxic treatments for kids. And so our Ewing sarcoma study takes the patients who have either failed to respond to this initial treatment or have relapsed, and we are hopeful that we'll be able to make a big impact on these kids and young adults and the progression of their disease. And the reason this is so important is if you relapse or fail to respond to initial therapy, you're looking at about a 70 to 80% 5-year mortality rate. It's just a devastating disease, and we really hope that we're going to be able to make a difference in the lives of these patients and their families.
Because it's a cancer of the bone, are there specific groups that it attacks, or are all bone tissue? Is all bone tissue fair game for this cancer? Well,
typically, and you can never make broad-based statements, but Ewing sarcoma many times begins in the leg or maybe the arm. But the devastating part of the disease is the spread. As is the case with many cancers, the primary tumor will generally begin in the bone, and then it begins to spread to other parts of the body, and that's where the progression takes place, and that's usually the most devastating part of the disease.
Have you been involved, or are you aware of what causes this? Is it a genetic thing? Is it environmental? What causes this type of cancer in the young and the young adults?
So, Neil, that's a great question. And luckily, there's a tremendous amount of information and just some tremendous research that's been done by the medical community in Ewing sarcoma. So it's a fairly well understood illness, which makes the possibility of treatments all that more promising. So what happens is the body incorrectly reads healthy genes. And because of incorrectly reading them, the body will take two proteins. It will break them into pieces, shouldn't happen, and join two halves of proteins that never should be joined together. And that's called a translocation. This translocation of halves of two separate proteins that should not be joined together creates what's called an oncoprotein, as in oncology, and they begin growing Ewing sarcoma tumors. Now, if there can ever possibly be good news when you're talking about an illness like this, is because the cause is didn't have the opportunity for treatments or the development of treatments and the research of new treatments is strong. Now, we haven't found anything yet, but we think we're on the right track.
Currently, your company is involved, in a phase 1 trial for treatment of Ewing sarcoma. Tell me a little bit about your lead drug that's going to be in this phase 1 trial.
So our lead drug is seclidemstat. And I really want to give a quick shout out to the Huntsman Cancer Institute and the University of Utah, specifically Dr. Sunil Sharma and Dr. Stephen Lesnick, both of whom they were researchers at the Huntsman Cancer Institute, and they've moved on to even in bigger positions at Nationwide Hospital and TGen down in Phoenix, Arizona. And these two individuals were instrumental in identifying an enzyme called LSD1 as a target, and we'll talk to you in a moment about that. And then Dr. Sharma's lab was instrumental in identifying drugs that could impact that enzyme. So to take a very complicated story, and I have to share with you, I'm not a clinician, so I like to talk about this in broad terms. To take a very complicated story and tell it in a sentence or two, this translocation that I talked about, we believe requires the LSD1 enzyme in order to send its messages to the body. So we believe we have a drug, seclidemstat, that is going to inhibit that enzyme from taking its action. So we're effectively cutting off the communication channel between this oncoprotein, this translocated oncoprotein, and cutting off its communication pathway. And without that ongoing signaling, the Ewing sarcoma tumors, at least in animal models, stops growing. Well, it starts growing at a much slower rate. It plateaus and then begins to melt away. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to repeat or duplicate some of those results in our human trials.
Do you have any, in wrapping up, do you have any idea how many people will be participating in these trials?
We do. So a phase 1 clinical study is all about safety. Doing no harm is paramount. So the initial study is probably about 30 to 40 patients. And we will approach this study, or we are approaching the study. The study is active in two parts. The first part is called dose escalation. So we will be treating patients at a dose and making sure that our advisors approve that dose is safe, and then we'll move to the next higher dose. And once we've established what's called the maximum tolerated dose, we will then add more patients to the study in what's called a dose expansion study. And that will allow us to treat a broader group of patients for a longer period of time and further populate and expand our safety database. Now, in these trials, these are what's called open label trials, which means patients do have the disease and we are treating them. So with a little bit of luck and a little bit of hope, we may actually begin to see the possibility of some initial patient responses. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Well, sounds promising and exciting, and hopefully bring in a lot of hope to some of these patients. Are you aware of how many kids are suffering from this type of cancer in the United States?
We have some information on that. About 400 to 500 new patients are diagnosed each year in the United States. And now that's an incredibly small number. And what many people don't know is that in the United States, there are only about 16,000 childhood cases of cancer diagnosed each year. So while these are devastating illnesses, with our youngest, patients who have their whole life ahead of them, unfortunately, these are not the big multi-billion-dollar indications that many people like to explore from an investment perspective, which is why the support that we receive from foundations and in our case, the state of Texas through their Cancer Prevention and Research Institute makes our development efforts, possible. So to get back to your question, it's not a large group of people. We are a rare disease. We're an orphan disease. The FDA has already recognized us as an orphan indication. So overall, there are probably somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 patients overall in the United States. Those numbers are really hard to come by, but we're focusing on the ones that we know about that are diagnosed and are currently struggling with their treatment.
Well, where can our listeners go and learn some more about Solarius and your clinical programs?
Well, they can go to salariuspharma.com, which is our website. We have information on the company and links to information about our clinical trials, which also contains the sites where we're conducting these trials and the investigators that they can reach out to if they have further interest.
Great. Well, David, I thank you for joining us on the program. Lots of great information, and I'm wishing you all the best in your trials, obviously, and for the patients as well.
Well, thank you, Neil, and it's been a real pleasure to be here.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Transcripts and audio of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au.
Thank you for listening to Health Professional Radio. We're very proud to be an independent broadcaster providing our content free of charge to you, the listener. One of the ways that we're able to remain free and independent is by having people like you become patrons. You can support Health Professional Radio simply by visiting hpr.fm and clicking the button that says Become a Patron. Your patronage of even just $1 a month lets us know that you're there, which in turn makes us more valuable to advertisers. And, of course, if you're able to afford more, then we would certainly appreciate the support. My name is Toby Longhurst from Health Professional Radio. Please visit hpr.fm, click the Become a Patron button, and support us if you can.